tests of hovercrafts designed by VI. Levkov were only a part of my work. Perhaps the most time in the pre-war year was taken up by tests of prototypes of large torpedo boats. The importance of rapid arming of the fleet with new, more seaworthy, and having a greater range of torpedo boats, replenishment of water area protection formations with anti-submarine boats, was realized by the leaders of our fleet. The command paid much attention to the construction of combat boats for various purposes. In the summer of 1936, the staff of the Leningrad plant, which specialized in the construction of boats, nominated a deputy to the Supreme Soviet of the USSR commander of the KBF Ivan Stepanovich Isakov. The commander visited his constituents, inspected the plant. He paid attention to wooden boats built for the Maritime Border Guard. Such patrol boats, when armed with a noise detector, could be used to fight against submarines. In 1938 Isakov, being already Deputy Commissar of the Navy for Shipbuilding and Armament, ordered a large series of boats Mo-4 small submarine hunters. At the same time, an order was issued to one of the instrument-making plants for hydroacoustic equipment for them. In the pre-war years, about 200 Mo-4s were built. With displacement of 56 tons, they were armed with two 45mm semi-automatic guns, two 12.7mm machine guns, depth bombs. During the Great Patriotic War, the artillery armament of the Mo-4 was considerably strengthened. A year later, in the summer of 1939, Isakov visited the shipbuilders again. Lokshin showed the Admiral torpedo boats of D3 and D2 types, with wooden hulls developed by the Shipyard Design Bureau. The technical specification for them was identical to the one issued by the Navy for torpedo boats with steel hulls of SM3 type. Efim Yakovlevich Lokshin, a great enthusiast of wooden shipbuilding, chief designer L.L. Amash, and the whole team of the workshop where the boats were built, worked proactively and skillfully. It took only 2 years for the project and creation of prototypes. The plant received an order for these boats D3, the advantages of which were immediately appreciated by I.S. Isakov. He was also commissioned to build a wooden boat of smaller displacement type D2. By order of I.S. Isakov, I was appointed chairman of the Commission for Testing of Experimental Torpedo Boats of D3 and D2 types. As soon as the plant reported on the readiness for the tests, began to go to sea. Soon it became clear that the boat type D2, by its qualities, does not fully meet the requirements of the fleet. It was wobbly, not stable enough on straight courses yawing, and in terms of displacement D2 was not much superior to the famous G5. But tests of D3 showed that this boat has good maneuverability and quite satisfactory seaworthiness. With a displacement of 40 tons and the total power of 3 engines GAM, 3,600 horsepower, it could give a speed of 48 knots. The best foreign models of comparable type reached such speed only 15 years later. At the same time, D3 had a longer range, 355 miles versus 220 for the G5, and therefore could be considered a long-range torpedo boat. Without waiting for the end of the tests, our People's Commissariat issued an order to the plant to build a pilot series of 6 D3 boats. Further tests of D3 and D2 boats continued on the Black Sea. I also came to the Black Sea boat builders. "Your wooden ones will not fall apart at sea?" asked Comrade Andrei Mikhailovich Filippov, my old acquaintance and colleague. "Because we have experience in this part." In response, I told how much attention is paid to the quality of materials by boat builders and us, receivers. Wood is used only of the specified moisture content of certain species. Control is very strict. Once, when the moisture content of wood was higher than the norm, we stopped production. Efim Yakovlevich was out of his mind. The plan had been disrupted. Alexei Nikolaevich Krylov was invited to settle the dispute. The academician took out of a voluminous briefcase and spread on the table numerous notebooks, carefully studied the technical documentation for the boat D3, and then listened to both sides. "The timber must be of the right moisture content," summarized Alexei Nikolaevich. "But there isn't any." The director couldn't help himself. "It is necessary to have it," replied calmly the academician, and began to stow his notebooks. The prejudice against torpedo boats with wooden hulls and fears of the commander had their grounds. In the early 30s here was tested boat designer P. When calculating the hull were gross errors. The first trips to the sea very clearly showed the fragility of the hull structure. The plating separated, the water entered the boat. Only thanks to the efforts of the crew was able to reach the base. And here on the next outing, when the struggle with the incoming water started again, the hand of the motorist N. Sightshave with a fluttering fish of rather decent size came out of the engine compartment. It turned out to be the last straw that overflowed the cup of patience of the commission that accepted the boat. The tests were suspended. However, as it turned out later, the motorists had stocked the fish even before leaving. And now D3 was to prove that the wooden hull is not less strong than the duralumin hull. Both experimental boats were delivered from Leningrad to Odessa by railroad. They made the passage to the torpedo boat base in fresh weather on a destroyer's tow. It was the first test of their strength. At the base, D3 and D2 were put on keel blocks. Engineers from Tsagi, who were members of the commission, mounted in the hulls of the boat's devices for measuring the loads on the hull plating and hull set. Now it was possible to count on obtaining an objective picture of their reliability on long runs and at significant waves at sea. Sea trials of the boat were held simultaneously with the testing under a special program torpedo apparatus of a new design with onboard torpedo dropping device. Its designer F.V. Palaev and military engineer N.K. Surovov hurried me with its implementation. We had to make sure not only in the reliability of the apparatus at different wave strength and speed of the boat, but also to develop recommendations for its use. The tests of torpedo apparatuses took place in a special polygon, a section of the sea with relatively shallow depths. After practicing the firing of dummy torpedoes, we started the main thing, the firing of training torpedoes. Alas, as it happens sometimes when working with torpedoes, not everything went smoothly. They happened to sink. We had to hang around in the firing range, waiting for divers to find a steel cigar at the bottom. Sometimes they found it quickly, sometimes they searched for several days and found someone else's cigar, previously lost by some loser. In the end, the tests of torpedo tubes were successfully completed. Now it was the turn of sea trials of the boat. We were waiting for fresh weather with a wave of 5 or 6 points. As luck would have it, the Black Sea was shining smooth under the rays of the hot sun, and the forecasts did not promise a change in the weather. I decided that it wouldn't hurt to check D3 in a big passage and at calm sea. And here we are on our way to Odessa. The engines are humming smoothly, the boat is rushing forward, leaving behind the stern a foamy whirlpool. All mechanisms and devices work perfectly. I mentally list the items of the program of acceptance of experimental boats tested torpedo apparatuses of a new design located on the sides, at a wave of 2 or 3 points accepted modes of full stroke. And now the test in a campaign at a range inaccessible for boats of G5 type. The passage passed safely. The Black Sea boatmen made sure that new boats capable of making long-range raids to the enemy's shores are coming to replace G5 boats of coastal action. And still the point of the program on testing in stormy conditions could not be closed. Finally, at dawn, I was awakened by a telephone call. The weather, comrade captain of the second rank, is just right. You'll have a good time tumbling on the wave. I heard the voice of the duty officer. There's already a notification for you. The support ship is getting ready. I dressed quickly and hurried to the pier. Tight wind blows in my face. Incoming buoy roars, announcing the storm. One look at the deserted, foaming sea, at the formidable waves of the surf is enough. The weather is just right for the tests. I decide not to wait for the support ship. It is slow and go out immediately. I get permission from the duty officer, and now our D3 is leaving the bay. All 3 engines are running at full throttle. Boat Commander A. Shalnov acts skillfully, periodically changes the position of the boat relative to the wave as required by the test program. The boat overcomes a 5-point wave well, and the breeze is getting stronger. Shalnov shouts to me, perhaps, the wave is already 6 points. The storm is gaining strength. I look at my watch. It's already been an hour since the boat is going at full engine speed. Everything is all right. It's time to switch to the economic mode. But then I am touched on the shoulder. Why, Schnitzer, the responsible handler of the plant, asks me to go down to the engine compartment. A minute, and I am at the roaring engines. The motorist shows me the joint of the board plating and the bottom. I look closely, and at the first moment I can't believe my eyes. The plating is breathing. At some moments in the gaps between the planks there is a glimpse of water rushing under the bottom. It is impossible to reduce speed while the boat is hydroplaning. It is relatively safe. The bow is raised above the water. It is only necessary to reduce speed. But you can't go full throttle either. The hull may be about to collapse. Run ashore. I reject that idea immediately. We have to save the boat. After all the tests will have to start all over again. And the boat was brought from Leningrad. The transfer to serial production of the D3, so necessary for the fleet, will be delayed. I jump out on deck, run into the deckhouse and stand behind the wheel. I take control. Slowly reducing speed. Engineers report from their compartment. Breathing. Breathing less. And finally, we're in place, all right. I sighed with relief. It means that we will reach the base at 30 knots. Now I remember that our cameraman, who is supposed to film the boat's progress on the storm wave, has not started working yet. Unfortunately, he did not fulfill the task. With the continuous blows to the hull of the 6-point wave, shooting was impossible. The boat safely reached the base and moored at the pier. The mood of all members of the commission is the worst. Are the skeptics right and the wooden hull cannot provide the necessary strength? No, I'm sure the designer's calculations are correct. But to find the cause of the accident, it is necessary to raise the boat on the wall. And the storm does not stop, preventing the floating crane to approach the berth. It's been 24 hours. Once again, the Black Sea summer sun burns the skin. D3 on the wall. We carefully examine the entire set of the hull, every centimetre of plating. There is a defect only in one place, the very place where the plating breathed. The defect is a production defect. The factory made a mistake during construction, not fastening the inner layer of plating with the hull set. And yet, holding only on the outer layer, 2-layer plating provided the strength of the hull at 30 knots, and even at 6 points. The defect was immediately eliminated, and I reported to Deputy Commissar of the Navy I.S. Isakov that the D3 long-range torpedo boat successfully passed sea trials. Ivan Stepanovich, who was at that time in the base, positively assessed the work done by the Commission, agreed with the conclusion that the boat should be adopted by the fleet, but scolded me for going out into the stormy sea without a support ship. Without wasting time, the Navy Commissariat issued an order for the construction of several dozens of D3 boats. At the end of 1940, the work was already boiling on the slipway. Unfortunately, in the spring of 1940, it turned out that the production of 1,250 horsepower engines, which were installed in accordance with the project on the D3 boats, had been discontinued. I had to carry out additional calculations and tests with motors of lower power. I was disappointed with the results. With 1,000 horsepower motors, the boats will not give more than 40 knots. The transfer of the first D3 boat to the Black Sea boat builders did not take long, and soon I left for Leningrad to continue the tests of Crocodile VI. Levkov. During the inevitable pauses in the work of a tester, I had to deal with the torpedo boat of the Komsomolets type, acceptance of which was conducted by N.E. Kavin and D.L. Blinov, almost not differing in displacement from the G5 type boats, which were manned by units in the fleets. Komsomolets had tube torpedo tubes, could carry more powerful anti-aircraft and anti-submarine armament. Unfortunately, during sea trials it showed serious shortcomings in maneuverability qualities. The boat had to be returned to the designers for improvement. Winter came. Navigation in the Gulf of Finland was over. But at the berths in the harbours of Kronstadt, is spacious, the ships went to new bases in the Baltic, on Hanko, a peninsula leased from Finland. With regret, I learned in those days that the headquarters of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet do not pay due attention to the basing system of torpedo boats. Meanwhile, in the conditions of the Baltic theatre, there was an urgent need for the early establishment of manoeuvring bases, especially on the islands of the Moonsund Archipelago and the Gulf of Finland. I believed that this important matter could not be delayed, and I took the liberty to send a corresponding report to the People's Commissar of the Navy, N.G. Kuznetsov. At the same time, I petitioned for the re-equipment of one of the Defense Ministry's boats to a floating base for a squad of torpedo boats, according to my project. The People's Commissariat of the Navy reacted quickly. The Navy received the corresponding directive, and the plant received an order to build a boat base. And one more very necessary thing I managed to complete before the war winter. I submitted to the publishing house the manuscript of the manual on the tactics of torpedo boats. This book summarized many years of experience in combat use of the Mosquito fleet. In early February 1941, I left for Odessa. Together with me went N.E. Kavin. With Naum Efimovich, who graduated from Frunz College 2 years earlier than me, I began my service on the Kronschlotte, and now I met again. He had just been returned to the Navy cadre. Since 1930, when N.E. Kavin was seconded to industry as a delivery captain of torpedo boats, he managed to work at various factories and graduated from the Industrial Academy. Together with him, Dmitry Leonidovich Blinov, an old sailor who fought in the First World War on the heroic destroyer Thunder and in the Civil War on the Caspian Sea, was appointed commissioner for the acceptance of ships. For several years he managed a factory that built boats for border guards. Both of them really knew their business and enjoyed unquestionable authority among industry workers. The slushy Black Sea winter, almost continuous rains did not prevent us from quick acceptance of several small submarine hunters in Odessa. These were boats of Mo-4 type, which fought perfectly in all fleets during the Great Patriotic War. They were handed over to us by the representative of the plant G. N. Borovsky. In 2 weeks we were already in Sevastopol. Here we had a more difficult job waiting for us: acceptance of the experimental boat SM3, which I have already mentioned earlier, and serial G5, on which the aircraft internal combustion engines were replaced by high-speed diesel engines. SM3 has not yet been prepared for testing, and we with N.E. Kavin decided to check the progress of construction of torpedo boats at one of the southern factories. The tall new building of the workshop, specially erected in connection with the complete reconstruction of the old shipyard, made an impressive impression. On the slipway, where 6 G5 boats were laid down, local workers and fine craftsmen from Leningrad, who had known me for many years, worked they passed on their experience, taught me the secrets of a difficult profession. The director of the plant, N.M. Isakov, and chief engineer R. I. Agajanov showed me the shops and asked me to tell the leadership of the People's Commissariat of the Navy that in June they would present the first serial boats for testing. One could hope that soon, very soon, this southern plant would start supplying the Navy with dozens of G5 torpedo boats. On my return to Sevastopol, I made sure that the SM3 was ready to go to sea for trials. It was time to get down to work. First of all, it was necessary to check the strength and reliability of the steel hull. At sea, deficiencies in the construction of SM3 began to be revealed at once. The thin steel sheet cladding in the area of the engine foundations was noticeably vibrating, swelling and settling. Some nut on the deck was bouncing like a grasshopper. There was nothing surprising in it. The longitudinal set of the hull was formed by light stringers of angle channel and motor foundations, and in the transverse set the spars were too far apart. The vibration of the foundations, on which the high-speed motors stood, resulted in dangerous vibration of the plating. However, all was well until we went out for sea trials. That's when the accident happened. At 42 knot speed, the hull, made of thin 4mm steel, cracked, and water began to enter the compartments. The crack was in the middle of the engine compartment, almost from side to side, which threatened to break the boat in two with a 4-point wave. We had to slow down and turn on a course to the base. Fortunately, SM3 had time to approach the mooring and the water inflow into the boat stopped. The tests showed that the SM3 could not be recommended for serial production. However, the members of the commission decided that the boat could be used if the strength of the hull set could be increased by installing additional spandrels and stringers. This work was started immediately. We thought that SM3 would become heavier, displacement would increase a little and speed would decrease, but it would become more reliable. And then the Black Sea Brigade would get one more long-range torpedo boat. It should be said that during the Great Patriotic War, both D3 and SM3 were used for long-range raids to the coasts occupied by the enemy. At the end of December 1941, it was SM3 of Senior Lieutenant I.S. Belousov that landed a reconnaissance group on Cape Chorda before the beginning of the Kerch-Feodosia operation. A few days later, during the landing, the same boat twice approached the Crimean coast near Kerch, diverting the Hitlerites' artillery fire. In June 1942, torpedo boats D3 and SM3 broke into Yalta Bay and struck the ships standing in the harbour with torpedoes and rockets, destroying a torpedo boat and a small submarine of the enemy. In August of the same year, D3 and SM3 distinguished themselves again, having sunk 2 landing barges of Hitlerites near Feodosia with torpedoes. Why were these boats used by the Black Sea Fleet Command to carry out strikes on enemy bases? Of course, because they were long-range boats seaworthy, with a large radius of navigation. It was difficult to use G5-type boats here. It was not in vain that our shipbuilders worked in the years before the war, creating new types of large torpedo boats. It was not in vain that we spent so much effort on their testing and fine-tuning. Having finished testing the SM3, I spent a few days at one of the factories, also switching to the construction of torpedo boats. Here they were just preparing to lay the first hulls. I knew that the situation was approximately the same at the plant in the east of the country. Consequently, in 1941 the Navy could receive only 6 G5-type boats, which were being built on the Black Sea, and several D3 boats of the Leningrad plant. Not enough. And the completion of the construction of boats in Leningrad, unfortunately, was delayed. It was necessary to carry out modifications for other, less powerful motors. It was crowded on the streets of Kerch on Sunday, June 22, 1941. But I did not have to think about rest on that day. We planned to go out to test another G5-type boat. We worked without days off. According to the long-standing naval habit, I came to the port at about 8 in the morning when the flag was hoisted. At the berth, the engines of the boat were humming. Motorists were preparing to go to sea. To my surprise, the always punctual Lieutenant Captain V.I. Dovgai, the commander of a separate detachment of boats of the naval base, who was to go to the trials, did not show up. Having listened to the report of the responsible surrenderer from the plant on readiness for the trip, I called the operational duty officer of the naval base headquarters and requested permission to go out. But the duty officer asked me to wait. I called again and again. The operative did not give permission. Finally, having lost patience, I called the chief of staff of the base and asked what is the matter after all. The test schedule is disrupted. Without explaining anything, the chief of staff said that he asked me to come to him. I called for a car and went outside the gate. Half an hour later, the MK arrived. Why did not come for a long time? I asked the chauffeur. The war, comrade commander, he says calmly, as if the event has long been known. That's why I was late. I was listening to Molotov's speech on the radio. Hitler attacked. Our troops are fighting everywhere. Sevastopol was bombed by the Germans. The chief of staff of the base informed me about the situation in the Black Sea Fleet. Air raid on the main base of the fleet Sevastopol did not bring success to Hitlerites. All ships are intact. There is no destruction in the city and casualties among civilians. The fleet began hostilities. Well, and you, I think, need to accelerate the testing of boats and transfer them to the fleet. Our brigade of torpedo boats finished captain first rank. Of course. In a day or two I'll set up the work. I'll entrust the acceptance Dovgayu and leave for Sevastopol. It is necessary to request orders from Moscow from the General Staff, and I am still transferring to the fleet SM3. Having agreed at the base headquarters on the organization of the boats for trials, the order of applications and provision, I returned to the port. G5 still went to sea. Thus, on the first day of the war, the first torpedo boat of the southern plant was tested, and the Navy received another unit. Dovgai acted confidently, competently, meticulously checked the boat on all points of the program. Therefore, I calmly entrusted him with further work on acceptance and left for Sevastopol. I did not leave the window of the car, looking at the familiar landscape of the steppe Crimea. And in Dzhankoy and Simferopol is quiet. It seems that nothing has changed. Only looking up into the sky, anti-aircraft guns and columns of mobilized on the square at the Simferopol railway station testify to the war. The train is approaching Sevastopol. Here is the northern bay at the piers, and on the roadstead are ships. At anti-aircraft guns Red Fleet in helmets. We pass Inkerman caves formed in the quarries, where a century and a half of white stone was extracted, of which Sevastopol is built. At the entrances to the galleries crowds of women with children. Apparently, people took shelter here from enemy air raids. Goring's aces do not spare peaceful cities. Spanish Guernica, Dutch Rotterdam, English Coventry come to mind. Aye. From the station I go to the headquarters of the Brigade of Torpedo Boats. Combrig A.M. Filipov tells me about the Hitlerites' attempt to mine from the air exit fairways to lock the fleet in Sevastopol, the dispersal of the brigade on maneuvering bases, the fact that the division AAA Mesnikov is already in Odessa. Not a single boat has not lost. Everything is going as it should, says the brigade commander, and our Ochakov brigade is already fighting in the mouth of the Danube. People's Commissar transferred the fleet to operational readiness 1 almost 2 hours before the German raid on Sevastopol, adds one of the staff commanders, so we had time to prepare for the meeting. Unexpected attack on the bases of the Black Sea Fleet did not work. I told the commander that I would try to transfer it as soon as possible to the SM3, and there whatever Moscow orders. That's how we parted. The following days of the week were occupied with the work on completion of repairs and alterations on SM3, as well as tests of the G5 boat with diesel engines. Diesels, installed on it, instead of the usual aircraft internal combustion engines, proved to be excellent. Low fuel consumption provided twice as much range at the same tank capacity, and the replacement of high-octane gasoline with diesel increased the survivability of the boat. There could be only one conclusion to transfer engine building plants to the production of high-speed diesel engines, to install them on all boats under construction, and even replace them with internal combustion engines on the boats in the fleet. The tests of the diesel boat were conducted by NE Kavin and diesel engineer P. Panzerny. It should be said that in the creation of high-speed diesel engines for the fleet, Soviet engineers were ahead of both Germany and the United States. They were ahead, as well as in diesel engines for tanks. It is known that it was the diesels that provided a significant advantage of our T-34, KV and other tanks over the German ones. In the US and England, gasoline engines were installed on combat boats throughout the Second World War. Unfortunately, during the Great Patriotic War, it was not possible to deploy mass production of diesel engines for boats in our country. Engine building plants were working with extreme load for tank and aviation industry. After the acceptance of the G5 with diesels was completed, we formalized its transfer to the brigade with an act. Now it was necessary to launch the SM3. But the rear of the fleet did not give a floating crane, without which it seemed impossible to lower the boat from the height of a 2-meter wall. We had to turn for help to the commander of the Black Sea Fleet F.S. Oktyabrsky, taking advantage of our long acquaintance from our service on torpedo boats. "I'm sorry, Boris Viktorovich, but I won't give you a crane, I'm busy." "And for a long time," said the Admiral. "But here's a good advice, please. On the ship side we have dashing old men living in bunkhouses. Former sailors. So they can do anything, not just a boat. They can launch a cruiser on their hands." There was no way out, so I had to take Philip Sergeevich's advice. Indeed, the old men were wonderful, and with the help of hoists, bars and home-made jacks, they lowered the boat as carefully as no crane operator could. After that, we started control outings on the SM3. Days went by. Reports were not happy the enemy was advancing deep into the territory of the country. Hitler's aviation made raids on Sevastopol. The minesweepers were looking for German mines on the fairways. Some of them were etched, destroyed by depth bombs that were dropped by boats, but still the tugboat SP-12 exploded and died, and the new destroyer Fast, which was undergoing tests, also exploded on a mine, managed to stick to the shoal at the Konstantinovsky Ravelin. The war was quickly becoming everyday life. On the streets, in the courtyards of houses there appeared shelter slits. In the squares, anti-aircraft batteries. The raids became habitual. Sevastopol residents treated them as an inevitable evil the time of the first days, when rumours of enemy parachutists spread around the city and boys watched every, in their opinion, suspicious person. That's when a tragicomic story happened to NE Kavin and P.A. Panzerny. They went to the post office, located in the quarantined Slobodka, 1/2 kilometre from the base of torpedo boats. The tall, heavy, red-haired panzerni and the small, full, swarthy Kavin in steel helmets, with pistols and gas masks at their sides, were a very conspicuous pair. Their warlike appearance aroused the suspicions of the vigilant boy's gentleman. "Who are you?" My comrades did not dignify the young Sevastopolians with an answer. The boys followed them at some distance, throwing stones quite aptly at the parachutists. A crowd gathered, threatening shouts were heard. Fortunately, one of the boat commanders came across, who verified the identities of the suspects. Night raids of Hitlerites I more than once observed, standing at the exit from a peculiar hole, built in the precipitous shore of the Quarantine Bay. Here, under the ruins of the walls of ancient Chassanesos, in times immemorial were dug-out burial vaults. In the first days of the war, the buried entrances were cleared, and thanks to the ancient builders, these quite decent rooms accommodated the Red Fleet and commanders, the command post of the division of boats. Many-meter layer of stone reliably protected even from a direct hit of a large bomb. I remember well the dark, warm nights in Sevastopol of the first days of the war. Somewhere around midnight Hitler's bombers appear. They fly noiselessly, planning with turned-off engines, shadows sliding on the white houses of the quarantine Slobodka, illuminated by the treacherous moon. Ships and anti-aircraft batteries on the shore open fire. The guns of a nearby battery are thundering. Even the commands of its commanders are heard for the motherland, fire at the fascist invaders. Going to sea on the SM3 showed that after the reinforcement of the hull, the boat can be transferred to the fleet as a combat unit. The transfer of the boat to the brigade command did not take long. And now, fulfilling the order of LM Gala, I'm on my way to Moscow. Well, on the Black Sea has done everything possible. By the summer of 1941, the fleets had about 300 torpedo boats. Will the southern factories be able to work normally to provide replenishment of the fleets with boats? Maybe they will soon have to be evacuated. Apparently, the main attention should now be paid to the factories located to the east. Admiral LM Gala received me at the People's Commissariat of the Navy on the day of my arrival. I reported on the work done and expressed the opinion that it is necessary to transfer to the active fleets from the central warehouses as many spare parts as possible, and also proposed to send to the connections of boats motors such as a M34 and GAM34. These engines were once replaced on the boats more powerful, but now, when the fleets are almost no spare motors, they will go in business. Lev Mikhailovich approved my proposals and promised to give appropriate instructions to the technical department. "And now you must go to Leningrad," said the Admiral. "The task is as follows: pilot boats D3 ready and already tested to send to the Northern Fleet. The rest, those that are still under construction, as soon as possible to launch, test and also transfer to the Northern Fleet. We'll send you the engines and armament for them." In the evening I left for Leningrad. I was worried about the upcoming work. I knew that it would not be so easy to fulfill the order of LM Gala. And I was also worried about the long absence of news from my family. Even from Sevastopol, I told my wife not to send our children from Leningrad. 4-year-old Natasha and 8-year-old Leva, the children, were taken out of the city for fear of air raids by the Nazis. With Eni Kavin, who was summoned to Leningrad in early July, we agreed to evacuate the families somewhere to the northeast. But what came out of it, I did not know. With excitement, I pressed the bell button of my apartment. No one opens the door. I go in. On the table in the kitchen there is a note my wife has left for Borovichi, where their kindergarten was located. It remains to hope that all will end safely, though Hitlerites are rapidly moving forward and have already entered the limits of the Leningrad region. There is no time to indulge in unhappy thoughts. I hurry to the Factory 1E, EIA. Lokshin, as always businesslike and collected, informs me of the readiness to send by rail 5 boats D3 pilot series. But with serial boats of the same type the situation is not good. No engines and large caliber turret machine guns. We cannot give the fleet for the same reason, and several boats mow 4 small submarine hunters. Without delaying, I go to the fleet rear institutions to get from them spare engines stored in warehouses. Since the time when I served in the Baltic, I know that there are motors perhaps less powerful than necessary in the warehouses. Unfortunately, it turns out that we can get only a few motors. The main technical equipment in 1940 was moved to the west to Libava, Riga, Tallinn. We managed to get a few motors in the workshops of the Marine Border Guard. Good. At least we have something. Now we'll be able to put a few boats into service, and there, by order of LM Gala, hopefully will arrive engines and machine guns. By evening I go to the Moscow railway station to see off the family of N.E. Kavin, evacuated from Leningrad. The train leaves late in the evening. A curfew is already in effect, and the waiting rooms are full of refugee women and children. They are all waiting for morning to go out into the city. Suddenly I see my wife and children. It turns out that they have just arrived with some echelon. Though they had to experience a lot of hardship while they were getting to the city, but I feel calm here they are near, alive and unharmed. In the first days of August, the plant sent 5 D3s to the Northern Fleet. Consolidated into a separate detachment, these boats became the only unit of torpedo boats of the Northern Fleet. Only in March 1943 the detachment received its first replenishment 4 D3s and 2 American boats of the Higgins type. In the first half of August, several more serial D3 torpedo boats and mo-boats were received. True, on some of the 3 prescribed motors had to be installed only 1 standard motor each and 2 less power without reversers. In addition, the missing large caliber machine guns were replaced by twin aircraft caliber 7.62 mm, as well as the Army DP-1. But it was impossible to send these boats to the north, and they became part of the Red Banner Baltic Fleet. In the second decade of August, the plant received engines, and large caliber machine guns. LM Gala fulfilled his promise. Day and night there were works on the boats. In the same days, on one of the boats of the D3 type installed a launcher for RS rocket projectiles, which later received the name Katyusha in the army and the people. The tests were conducted in one day, and they were successful. This was not enough to make a decision to arm the D3 with eras. However, the factory had no launchers yet. The situation on the outskirts of Leningrad was becoming more and more alarming. Hitlerites were rushing to the city of Lenin. In the middle of August, the October Railroad was cut, and on the last day of the month the enemy captured MDA. Now only waterway through Ladoga connected Leningrad with the big land. By September the plant handed over the last boats to the fleet. In total in July-August we received from the industry about 30 small hunters and torpedo boats. It was a significant help to the Red Banner Baltic. We managed to finish the work in time the night raids of Hitler's aviation began, and then artillery bombardment. Lokshin informed me that he had received an order to start evacuation of the plant. In the middle of September, Admiral I. S. Isakov, Deputy Commissar of the Navy, ordered all commanders' commissioners authorized to accept ships to arrive in Ulyanovsky. So I parted with my native city for many years. I managed to send my family to Bashkiria in August. Their train was the last train that passed through the station MDA. The Nazis closed the ring of the blockade of Leningrad. The way to Ulyanovsky was long. We got there more than a week by tugboat across Lake Ladoga, by car to Volkov-Stroy, by train to Yaroslavl, and from there by steamer down the Volga. In Ulyanovsky I was summoned by the head of the shipbuilding department of the People's Commissariat of the Navy, NV, Isachenkov. Now we'll talk about my report with a request to send to the active fleet, I thought. And I was not mistaken. Here is the report, which you submitted as soon as you came here, the Admiral began. As you can see, it has a resolution. Refuse you, Comrade Nikitin, are needed for a very important work here in the rear. Do it, we'll think what to do with you next. Ships should be built here, in the east, in the Volga region, in the Urals. And NV. Isachenkov told about the evacuation of the southern shipyards, the shipyard where E.Y. Lokshin worked, from Leningrad, about the government's decision to allocate several enterprises in the rear to deploy on their basis the construction of torpedo, anti-submarine and artillery boats. I received an order to go together with N.E. Kavin to these plants, to make a report on the state of affairs and together with the management of the enterprises to develop proposals on how to better deploy serial production. But before that I had to take some big submarine hunters to the Caspian Sea. This work was being done there now by N.E. Kavin. A few days later I was already in Baku. In the port at the moorings stood big hunter's bow. Narrow steel hull with raised bow made them look like small destroyers. Armament bow consisted of 85mm gun on the tank, 2 large caliber machine guns, and large depth charges in bomb throwers at the stern. Hydroacoustic stations were not installed, as the equipment had not yet passed even the initial stages of testing. However, in conditions that did not allow to transfer large hunters neither to the Baltic nor to the White Sea, they were not needed as anti-submarine ships. They were to become tanker fleet guard ships to provide air defense during the passage along the Caspian Sea from Baku and Krasnovodsk-Kestrakan. But 85mm cannon could not fire at planes because of the small elevation angle, and machine guns were ineffective. Therefore, without interrupting the tests, Kavin and I addressed a letter to L.M. Gala, in which we proposed to install on the big Hunter's 37mm anti-aircraft machine gun and another large-caliber machine gun. We believed that this should be done, even if we had to remove from the boats large-depth bombs. Deputy Commissar immediately accepted our proposals and gave appropriate instructions. Work on strengthening anti-aircraft armament on the Hunters began immediately. By the end of December 1941, all the boats were transferred to the Caspian flotilla. In the following months, they accompanied tankers with liquid fuel on the Caspian Sea and Volga, participated in the Volga flotilla in the battles near Stalingrad. The work assigned to me was finished, and with the permission of Admiral L.M. Gala, I left for Ulyanovsk. From Baku by sea and further from Krasnovodsk through Tashkent to Orenburg by railroad. From Orenburg through the steppes, which once marched the peasant army of Pugoshev, on horses I reached the city of Meluz in Bashkiria. Here lived in the evacuation of the families of commanders from the Navy Admissions Office, including my wife and children. It was a great joy to meet the new year 1942 among my relatives. The radio brought news about the defeat of the Germans near Moscow, about the successful Kerch-Feodosia landing operation. After staying in the family only a day, I left for Ulyanovsk. From here began our trip with N.E. Kavin to the factories, which received the task to begin construction of combat boats. We had to familiarize ourselves with the work of design bureaus, where the boats were design bureaus. First of all, we decided to meet with the designers working on the projects of small submarine hunter and torpedo boat in a unified hull. The idea to build combat boats of these classes in the same hull was born in the pre-war year. Then N.E. Kavin and I submitted a detailed report to Admiral L.M. Gala, Deputy Commissar of the Navy. Lev Mikhailovich supported the proposal. The Industrial People's Commissariat was given the task to develop designs for boats in steel and wooden hulls. Only armament was to distinguish an anti-submarine boat from a torpedo boat. Unfortunately, the design and construction of prototypes could not be completed before the war. Now evacuated to the East, design organizations hastily completed the work started. In the Design Bureau, which we visited first, a torpedo boat and a steel-hulled hunter were being designed. The results of the SM3 tests on the Black Sea were not known to the local developers, and our story about the experience gained and insufficient strength of the steel hull set of this boat came at the right time. Design works for the rear plant, which launched the construction of river-armoured boats, were also carried out here. At the same time, at the suggestion of Vice Admiral Y.F. Rule, began construction of marine armoured boats in Leningrad. Artillery boats, very necessary for river flotillas, as well as for such fleets as the Baltic and Black Sea fleets, for action in coastal areas, were built by the factory evacuated from Ukraine. Despite great difficulties with equipment, provision of materials, housing for workers and engineers, the Ukrainians worked admirably. We came to the conclusion that by spring the plant, as planned, will give the front combat boats. Leningraders were also doing well at the new place. It was pleasant to learn from E.Y. Lokshin that the plant had successfully overcome the initial post-evacuation difficulties and was increasing the pace of construction of D3 torpedo boats. The production of our wooden hulls has been put on the stream, the director told me, when we went around the shops. In the billet shop they make parts according to standard templates. The hulls are assembled from them on the slipway. The chief designer of our design bureau, known to you Amash, has developed the project of a small hunter in the D3 hull. Now we build torpedo boats and small hunters of Mo D3 type in the same hulls. Unification. Things went faster. The flow method of assembling hulls from ready-made parts was developed at the Leningrad plant before the war by S.V. Pulgavko, V. Pulgavko. This talented, surprisingly versatile engineer, a specialist in diesel engines by main profession, also created a pipe torpedo apparatus for D3 and Komsomolets boats. In the tests of this apparatus on the Black Sea in 1941, I had an opportunity to take part. The Commission recommended to adopt it for service. Torpedo apparatus SV, Pugavko was very necessary for the fleet, as it protected torpedoes from icing. In the Northern Fleet, where torpedo boats fought in low temperatures, the apparatuses of onboard dropping, in which the torpedoes are not protected from the wave, proved unreliable. But the production of torpedo apparatuses had yet to be established. They were to be installed on the boat D3 and on the first serial Komsomoltsy, the construction of which was to deploy another, also evacuated from the West Factory. We visited this plant at the end of our business trip. The work here was just beginning. The hulls of G5 boats damaged during the long journey were being repaired on the slipways, and their completion was being started. Echelons with machine tools and other equipment were still on their way. An engineer I knew, VM. Berlikov, former head of the torpedo boat shop at the Leningrad plant, who was in charge of production here, asked me to speed up the delivery of aluminum for hulls and motors. Without this, the plant could not begin the deployment of serial construction of torpedo boats, such as Komsomolets. On the state of affairs with the construction of combat boats, we reported on arrival in Moscow LM Gala and People's Commissar. They supported our proposal to give a green street to wooden boat building. But along with D3, the main torpedo boat will be Komsomolets. It is good for the Baltic and the Black Sea, summarized the People's Commissar. The Commissariat has received aluminum for hulls. We will try to buy motors from the Americans, although our factories promise to increase supplies soon. From the US, promise to deliver and small caliber anti-aircraft guns 20-25mm. We are realizing the proposal to strengthen the anti-aircraft armament of torpedo boats. You are right, pointing out in your report that the boats cannot effectively defend against German aviation, added Lev Mikhailovich. It should be said that the issue of anti-aircraft armament of torpedo boats was not something new. Back in 1940, the Navy Commissar N.G. Kuznetsov, approving the construction of a large series of torpedo boats of the D3 type, demanded from the Industrial People's Commissariat to arm them with a small caliber anti-aircraft gun. However, neither the 45mm semi-automatic gun nor the 37mm automatic gun, which the industry had just mastered at that time, could not be installed on the torpedo boat because of their weight and dimensions. 20-25mm guns, being developed to arm fighter planes, were still at the stage of testing prototypes. Thus, before the war, it was not possible to achieve a solution to this issue. The experience of combat torpedo boats immediately showed that the desire of our commissar to strengthen the anti-aircraft armament of the boats was quite reasonable. If the boats of the Ministry of Defence, with the help of their 40-50, successfully repelled the attacks of Heinkels, Junkers and Messerschmitts, and many of them shot down, torpedo boats could only evade. Using maneuver and speed machine guns in the fight against aircraft were ineffective. Torpedo boats also had a hard time in battles with enemy patrol boats armed with automatic guns. Attempts to partially armour the boat's deckhouses or cover with cork belts, of course, could not bring success. There was only one way out: to install small-caliber automatic guns. A few days later, in the first days of July, I flew to Baku on an old Navy reconnaissance airplane P-6. Fortunately, I had an opportunity. At intermediate airfields, pilots of LAGs, the newest fighters, looked at the airplane with surprise. Our old man also confused the airfield team in Astrakhan. At first, it was mistaken for an enemy one. In these days, the Germans were rushing to Stalingrad, took Elista, and moved through the steppes of Kalmykia. I saw columns of Hitler's troops, stretching from the southwest to Stalingrad, obviously from the North Caucasus, and during the flight from Astrakhan to Makhachkala. In Baku, I immediately began the acceptance of the next big hunter with reinforced anti-aircraft armament. Both the team of factory workers and the crew worked practically without rest, taking only 4 hours a day for sleep. Everyone understood the formidable danger hanging over the motherland. Barely having time to finish the acceptance, I received an urgent order to arrive in Moscow. This time I got there by airplane. We flew through Krasnovodsk and Guryev. At the General Staff, I learned that I was included in the commission for testing of the Guard's RS mortars on armoured boats of the Volga flotilla. I have already written about the tests of RS-30 on the boat D3 in the fall of 1941 in the Gulf of Finland. They gave positive results. I also knew about the tests of rocket launchers and recoilless dynamojet guns, the so-called DRS, on torpedo boats of the Black Sea Fleet, conducted in the second half of the 30s. In his time, the development and testing of these new weapons was actively promoted by M.N. Tukhachevsky. Unfortunately, despite the positive results, the work was terminated and RS-30 and other types were not adopted by the Navy and Army. With the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, our industry quickly mastered the production of rockets RS-30 and RS-82. Guard's mortars, lovingly nicknamed at the front Katyusha, demonstrated high combat effectiveness in battles on the fronts of the Great Patriotic War near Moscow and Leningrad. Now, almost a year after the baptism of fire of this new type of weapon, it was necessary to test the possibilities of its application on armoured boats. Tests of serial armoured boats armed with rockets were held under the direction of the Chief of Staff of the Volga Flotilla, Rear Admiral M. I. Fedorov in the upper reaches of the Volga. The launchers for RS-30 M13 and for RS-82 M24 were placed on tank turrets, from which 75mm guns were removed. The launchers elevated above the low-sided boats somewhat impaired their stability and maneuverability, but within acceptable limits. The tests were successful, and soon the Volga flotilla, and then the fleets, primarily the Black Sea, received armoured boats with formidable weapons. Their powerful blows first of all experienced Hitlerites during the battles for Stalingrad. In addition, we recommended to start arming torpedo boats with rockets. The Commission proposed to do this, believing that boats with rocket launchers will allow to strengthen the attacking groups when striking at sea against enemy ships and provide powerful fire support during landing operations and assistance to the seaside flank of the army. There was already experience of such use. The Black Sea, on their own initiative, manufactured launchers for 4 RS-30 shells and mounted them on 3 torpedo boats. These boats successfully operated in battles with well-armed artillery boats and fast-landing barges of Hitlerites, which had 75 and even 100mm guns. By the end of the summer of 1943, on the Black Sea, from the first boats received from the industry, with M13 rocket launchers formed the first detachment. He joined the 2nd Brigade, which was commanded by Captain 2nd Rank V.T. Protsenko. This allowed gunboats to make powerful strikes on the troops and fortifications of the Nazis on the coast and successfully act against their ships during the fighting for the liberation of Novorossiysk, and the Kerch-Eltigen Operation.it was July 42nd year. I had just returned to Moscow after completing tests of rocket launchers Fleet Katyusha on armoured boats of the Volga flotilla. I had to report the results to Admiral L. M. Galla, Deputy Commissar of the Navy. Lev Mikhailovich received me in his office in the Commissariat building. Admiral came out from behind the desk and took a few steps towards me. That's how he met everyone, regardless of position and rank, said hello and warmly congratulated me on my award, the Order of the Red Star. A day earlier it was handed to me in the Kremlin by Mikhail Ivanovich Kalinin. Thanking for the attention, I reported to Lev Mikhailovich that the launches of rockets were successful. The Commission, in the work of which I took part, recommends to arm armoured gunboats and torpedo boats reactive mortars M13 and M1024. Soon I went again to one of the factories where torpedo boats were being built. It was necessary to find out how the designers and manufacturers were prepared for the installation of imported engines due to the fact that our engine building plants completely switched to products for aviation. The boats were to be installed in the United States Packard, engines with a capacity of 1,150 horsepower. On the delivery of these engines were able to agree even in the first visit to the USSR Harry Hopkins, personal representative of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. Having successfully and in time completed the business program of the trip, I returned to the capital. And here I am again at LM Gala. I report on the successful progress of construction of torpedo boats, small submarine hunters and armoured boats. As always, Lev Mikhailovich understands everything with half a word. He is sensitive to everything new and progressive. It is surprisingly good to work with him. Letting me go, the Admiral said that I should refrain from long trips. I will be needed soon. The meaning of this order became clear a few days later. The Admiral announced that I was included in the group of officers of our commissariat for a trip to the United States. Lev Mikhailovich explained that it is to receive from the Americans ships, weapons and equipment. All this will be delivered to the USSR under the law on Lend-Lease, that is, by loan or lease. A group of the People's Commissariat of the Navy will be part of the USSR State Procurement Commission. Everyone is going with their families. The business trip will be long. "Where is your family?" asked the Admiral. I answered that in Bashkiria. "Well, I think that 10 days will be enough for you. Go to get your wife and children and get ready for the long journey." Without wasting time, I went to pick up my family and began to prepare for the business trip. I took up English, stocked up on dictionaries and textbooks. I had to master the language from scratch. After all, I had studied German at school. And of course, I tried to get as much information as possible about the upcoming work. In the Department of External Relations of the main staff of the Navy told me that for the USSR in the United States are being built several large minesweepers, small submarine hunters and torpedo boats. The number of ships to be transferred to us is still unknown. The term of transfer is 1943. Accepted boats will be delivered to Murmansk and Arkhangelsk on transports, and minesweepers will pass independently. During the same days, while preparing for departure and drawing up the necessary documents, I got acquainted with the commanders included in the group, including P. Panzerny T.N. Banin P.A. Favorov A. N. Mingalev A. M. Koklov P.A. Igorov and Minor N. Ya. Dolganenko. All my service in the Navy was connected with combat boats. With my direct participation took place and the acceptance of new boats, torpedo and anti-submarine, and the development of tactics for their combat use. I knew that in recent years the United States has paid much attention to the construction and creation of new types of torpedo boats and gunboats in the US. Navy they were called submarine fighters. I also knew that during the First World War in the US, built for the British Navy submarine fighter boats. Then Russia bought such boats, and they operated in the Russian Black Sea Fleet, and during the Civil War in the Volga and Caspian Sea. Soviet Marine writer Sergei Kolbasyev, commander of the Red Fleet during the Civil War, wrote about the combat deeds of fighter boats. Shortly before departure, the officers of our group, along with their wives, were invited to a meeting with the Commissar of Foreign Trade I. Mikoyan. Anastas Ivanovich came out to us together with the Commissar of the Navy N.G. Kuznetsov. In the pre-war years, A.I. Mikoyan visited the States, new American industrial and commercial circles. We all listened with interest to his story. In a relaxed conversation, Mikoyan gave some practical advice, emphasized that the Americans are inherent in business, scope and enviable accuracy in the implementation of commitments. All this should be taken into account both in business communication and in personal contacts. A word is not a sparrow, said the People's Commissar, so one should think before promising something. But if you promised and agreed, then fulfill it strictly. He especially emphasized the importance of fast and timely deliveries to the USSR from the USSR, the need to link them with the timing of convoys across the Atlantic. Anastas Ivanovich advised our wives to help their husbands in everything, to work in the Soviet missions in the US, if possible, but not to the detriment of raising children. Continuing the conversation, the People's Commissar explained in detail the procedure for placing children in schools. Then N.G. Kuznetsov wished us success in our work and said a few words about the importance of the work assigned to us. And now came the day of departure. The train moved ahead was a long way to Vladivostok, sailing across the Pacific Ocean to the shores of America. From the station loudspeakers sounded Leviton's voice. The Red Army began the offensive in the Stalingrad area. Day by day the train is going eastward. In Perm, at the station, I hug my brother Vsevolod and his family. Back in the fall of the 41st they were here, having left Leningrad with their factory. We rejoice at the victory on the Volga, and once again we experience the pain of loss somewhere in Zadorny, on the outskirts of Stalingrad. My brother Victor was missing in action in 1942. Another brother Vladimir died near Kandalaksha. In the battles near Peterhof fell the son of the elder sister, our nephew Alyosha, a student of the first course of the Military Medical Academy, just a boy. We remember our friends and relatives who did not survive the blockade winter, Konstantin Alexievich Shilov, our common friend who died on the Baltic. The train slowly picks up speed. For a long time I stand at the window, looking at the harsh and majestic Ural landscapes. I can't help thinking about my future work. Will everything work out somehow? Yes, everything would be much clearer if I was going to the active fleet. For example, on the torpedo boats, with which my whole life is connected. The road, the very life of the wagon life, was conducive to acquaintance. I soon made friends with fellow travellers, especially with officers from the North Sea of our group. The division commander M.A. Milol, his deputy in the political part 5. M. Kulakov, chief of staff E.A., Komarov commanders. A. Commanders of minesweepers A.M. Savovich V.A., Babanov V.I., Shumilov, V.P. Morozov A. Lisov had combat experience of 1.5 years of war in the harshest conditions of the north. They were to take command of minesweepers, which the Americans pledged to transfer to the USSR. Once we are gathered in one of the compartments and MMN. Mole, in the recent past an officer of the staff of the Northern Fleet Water Area Protection, tells about the combat affairs of torpedo boats D3. With interest I learned details about the battle on September 11th, 1941, in which MN Mole took part. On that day 2 D3s A.O. Shibbolin and G. K. Svetlov brought down an enemy transport and a destroyer in Varenja Fjord. And after all, the Hitlerites had 3 more patrol boats, each of which had automatic guns of 37 and 20 mm caliber. 4 days later our gunboats Polyakov and Kapilin sent to the bottom 2 Hitler's transports. Of the two, the Germans' patrol boats had nothing to protect, adds E.A. Komarov. Sank transport and in October Shabalin torpedoed. It turned out that it was almost a regiment of huntsmen heading to Petsamo. We didn't go to sea in winter storms, engines were worn out. They repaired it by their own efforts. We repaired and patched the hulls, recalls V.M. Kulakov. Mechanics had a hard time, there were no spare parts. Interrupting each other, the commanders tell about the combat affairs of Mo 4 and D3 in 1942, about the single combat of small hunters with Hitler's planes, about how torpedo boats A. Kuksenko and B.F. Zimchenko sank an enemy submarine. F. Zimchenko. Behind conversations, stories about peaceful years and harsh trials of the war years, thinking about our future work in the US, time passes unnoticed. The train crosses the Urals and rushes across the expanses of Siberia. We pass Irkutsk. 2 centuries ago, this is where the explorers started their voyages that led to the shores of the Pacific Ocean. The way to Yakutsk and Okhotsk, to Kamchatka and Kurils, and finally to Russian America once started from this ancient Russian city. In Vladivostok, we had to wait 2 weeks for the transport that was to take our group to San Francisco. We decided to use the waiting days to meet with Pacific boatmen. We had to share with them the experience of combat use of torpedo boats in the North and the Baltic to learn their needs, which perhaps we could take into account in the United States. The Brigade of Torpedo Boats is commanded by Alexander Vasilievich Kuzmin. In the year of my first trip to the Pacific Fleet, he was a commander of a torpedo boat. Now he is already a famous boatman. The author of the book notes on the history of torpedo boats, popular in the Navy before the war. Neither he nor I, of course, could not know that in 2 years, in 44th, I will become the commander of the Soviet Brigade of Boats in Miami, and Kuzmin will head the Northern Fleet Brigade of Torpedo Boats, formed in large part from delivered from the United States Higgins and Vopper. Alexander Vasilievich willingly accepts my offer to meet with the brigade commanders. My guys will listen with interest to those who have already smelled gunpowder, says the brigade commander. You see, soon it will be 2 years in readiness, and it's not easy. Reports on transfer to the active fleet attack me continuously. What can I answer them? You have to serve where you're ordered. Admittedly, I myself would not mind. Talks with the personnel of the brigade went well. MN Mole shared the experience of combat use of torpedo boats and small hunters in the Northern Fleet. I told about the remarkable deeds of the Baltic, my students S. A. Osipov and V. A. Osipov. A. Osipov and V. P. Gumanenko, former Pacific pilot I. Afanasyev, who became the first of the boatmen to become heroes of the Soviet Union. The leader of our group, engineer captain of the first rank P. A. Pantserny, engineer captain of the third rank T. N. drew special attention of the Pacific Ocean crew to the necessity of excellent knowledge of the equipment, ability to repair all the equipment of the boats by their own efforts. This was once again confirmed by the experience of Baltic boatmen, who in the harshest conditions of the blockade winter, with the help of factory workers, overcoming incredible difficulties, repaired their boats and prepared them for the campaign of the 42nd year. The speeches of P.A. Panzerny and T.N.T. and Banin, who survived the blockade winter in Leningrad, made a great impression on the audience. With no less benefit in the circle of boat commanders and staff specialists of the brigade was the discussion of my book manual on the tactics of torpedo boats, which came out of print in July 1941. But finally, the days of waiting passed. We left Vladivostok on the transport Felix Dzerzhinsky, which belonged to the famous in those years Tolstoy. Our travelling companions were a group of diplomats heading to Australia via the USA. Only at sea we unexpectedly learned that the transport has to enter Nakhodka Bay, where it will receive cargo for 3 days. In this bay, lying in the northern part of America Bay, I had already visited in 1935. Then its shores were deserted. Now there was a harbour under construction. Years will pass, and in the waters of the bay will be reflected in the buildings of the beautiful city, and at the berths of its port to stand ships under the flags of all countries of the world. We enter the Sea of Okhotsk through the La Perouse Strait. It is stormy. A long wave strongly tilts the ship. It rocks a lot, despite the impressive displacement of transport 14,000 tons. Women do not leave the cabins. Only our children, restless boys and girls, are running on decks and gangways. The rocking does not affect them. The farther northward the Dzerzhinsky goes, the colder, more angry the wind is. It is freezing. Floating ice floes are encountered more and more often. On the eve of the new year 1943, we enter the solid ice. For several hours our captain tries to get through by his own forces to the port of Nagevo, but fails. We need the help of an icebreaker. So at sea we meet the new year. Our wives come to life. There is no rocking. The ship is drifting. Around is an ice field covered with white snow. Somebody has a saved NZ, and we, gathered in the wardroom, drink for the victory over fascism, for our friends who stayed in the West. On the 1st or 2nd of January we moored at the pier of Nagevo. It is winter here, and people walk along the streets in the corridors pierced in 2-meter thick snow. We reach Magadan by bus. Straight streets are built up with 3-4-storied stone houses. There are many stores, cinemas, and an excellent house of culture. A lot of labour had to be done to build the city on the shores of the harsh Sea of Okhotsk. Nagevo is the last port of call before America. Having finished loading, the Dzerzhinsky is on its way. Passage by the Sea of Okhotsk, and we are on the boundless expanses of the Pacific Ocean. Cape Lopatka, the southern tip of Kamchatka, stone piles of the Kuril Islands, is left behind. On the starboard side we pass the Commander Islands and say goodbye to the motherland. Now the ship is sailing by the Bering Sea to the Aleutian Islands, the long-standing route of Russian navigators, the discoverers of Russian America, as the northwestern part of the American continent was once called for a century. The weather is still not spoiling. Snow charges, stormy waves rocking the ship, force most passengers to spend time in the cabins and wardroom, where day after day there are fierce battles of dominoes. I read the Bering Sea log, studying the Aleutian Island chain lying south of our route on the map. The easternmost of the Matu and Kaska are called the Rat Islands. In the summer of 1942 they were occupied by the Japanese. I walk on the upper deck, inhaling the salty sea air with pleasure. Another passenger is also admiring the stormy sea. We get acquainted. It is a diplomat I. Zaitsev, going to work in Australia. Earlier he worked in the Soviet embassy in Japan. I learn a lot of interesting things about the policy of the Americans and British in the Pacific, about our relations with Japan. We remember that, before the defeat of the Nazis on the Volga, the Japanese not only stopped our ships in La Perouse Strait for illegal inspection, Japanese submarines torpedoed more than one Soviet transport, Japanese planes bombed and shelled Soviet ships. But now the situation has changed after the defeat of the enemy near Moscow, the encirclement of Paulus's army. The Japanese government began to realize in whose direction the scales on the Soviet-German front were tipping. Dzerzhinsky had not yet left the Bering Sea when we learned of the breakthrough of the blockade of Leningrad. It is difficult to convey our joy, to describe what feelings we felt. After all, everyone had something to do with the heroic city. Some had studied there, some had served or worked there, and some, like me and my family, had been born and lived there. Finally, the Bering Sea is behind us. The transport enters the Pacific Ocean near Unalashka, one of the Fox Islands, where the U.S. Navy's Dutch harbour base is located. Dzerzhinsky goes south, and every day the sea becomes more tender and the sun gets hotter. On a warm, sunny day of January 24th, 1943, our transport passes through the Golden Gate Strait into San Francisco Bay. All passengers on deck admire the city spread on the hills, the famous suspension bridge connecting San Francisco with the satellite city of Oakland. At noon, we entered the port and moored at the pier. The arrival of the Soviet vessel had clearly attracted the attention of the Americans. On the wall of the warehouse, just opposite our anchorage, several people, by the look of them workers, raised a large banner welcome, written on it in Russian. From the pier, from the crowd of plainly dressed people, apparently dock workers, we could hear greetings in English and Russian. Someone shouted that there were children on board, and immediately oranges, apples and candies flew on deck. But the ship's board is high, not everyone manages to get to it, and now the crane operator is leading a boom with a bucket with fruit hanging on a hook. A gong is heard, apparently the signal to work. People go away. So ended our first meeting with the Americans, during which not a single speech was made, but feelings of respect for the Soviet people, admiration for the heroic feat of the Soviet country, were expressed quite definitely. On the next day, the inspection of our foreign passports and entry visas began. The police official who conducted this procedure settled down in the wardroom of the Dzerzhinsky, and inviting everyone in turn, without asking a single question, took his time checking our documents with some papers in his bouvard. The formalities were over quite quickly. Officer Zaporozhenko of the Soviet convoy service arrived to pick us up. After saluting the flag of our homeland, we entered the land of the United States. Before leaving for Washington, where the leadership of the Soviet Procurement Commission was located, we were to spend a few days in San Francisco to familiarize ourselves with the shipyard of one of the shipbuilding companies. We were to inspect the ships being built there, some of which were destined for the USSR. This was our first assignment. The hotel where we were brought by Zaporozhenko turned out to be luxurious, almost the best in San Francisco. My wife and 2 children and I were assigned a 2-room suite. Fluffy carpet all over the floor, starched linen, a dozen towels, and a few mats in the bathroom. We settled in quickly. Our luggage was more than modest. Then we went down to the restaurant, where for the first time after leaving Negevievo Bay the women ate with appetite. The next day the officers went to the shipyard of the Auckland Shipbuilding Company. The shipyard was established already during the Second World War and built dry cargo transports of Liberty type. We were shown how the technological process was organized. The construction of ships was carried out by the method of assembly on slipways, to which the finished sections, welded in a special hull shop, were fed. 3 or 4 months after the first section was delivered to the slipway, the next Liberty left the shipyard. The clear rhythm of work and high organization were impressive. One of the engineers gave us explanations in Russian during the tour of the shipyard. It turned out that among the engineers of the Oakland Company there were many Russian emigrants who settled in California after the establishment of Soviet power in the Far East. After a tour of the shipyard, several Americans of Russian descent came up to us and asked us to talk about how their lost homeland was living. We did not sense any expressions of hostility. On the contrary, the emigrants admired and were proud of the successes of the Red Army, the victories at Moscow and Stalingrad. Meanwhile, our wives had time to buy everything they needed, from dresses for themselves and the children. To do this, of course, was not very difficult. Now our wives and children in their appearance quite corresponded to American standards. They were dressed tastefully, but modestly. It must be said that Americans, regardless of their social status, dress so as not to stand out, not to catch the eye. A year later, I was on a train from Washington to Miami. The car was a seated car with 2 or 3 dozen seats, rotating all 360 degrees. My neighbor was a handsome, very modest-looking elderly gentleman. He asked me who I was, with the usual American lack of primness. A conversation ensued. It turned out that the interlocutor had been before the revolution in Baku to the oil fields of millionaire Naval. Now he was on his way to Miami to see with his own eyes the oil field discovered in Florida, in the Everglades. Shortly before Miami, a neighbor handed me his business card. I read, Vice President of Standard Oil Company, Mr. But then I still noticed how this gentleman differs by his clothes from other passengers in his tie. There was a barrette with large diamonds worth $20,000. From San Francisco we went to Washington by train. The ingrowing into American life was not without amusing mishaps. On the road, one of the officers said that since we were abroad, it was necessary to tip. We decided to collect $1 per person for a day's journey. Thus, only my family had to pay $12, and our whole group more than $80. When we left the car in Washington, and one by one awkwardly, almost blushing, handed the Negro conductor his tips, he could not even say the traditional thank you, but only moved his lips, taking us, obviously, not for the overseas crees or for the crazy. Upon arrival in Washington, all the officers were invited by Rear Admiral M.I. Akulin, Deputy Chairman of the Marine Procurement Commission. He told us that we were to receive and send to the Soviet Union several minesweepers being built for us in the city of Tampa, as well as torpedo boats and rescue boats, which are supposed to be used as anti-submarine boats. I knew Mikhail Ivanovich Akulin as a specialist in the field of ship artillery, a man of great erudition, who had been more than once on government assignments in Italy, Germany, and the United States. I had the opportunity to meet him for the first time. The first impression, and it was confirmed in the course of further work together, was favourable. It was felt that this is a modest, energetic, and knowledgeable man. In the 30s, the Admiral had been to the USA on business trips and knew the country and its business world well. Later, I repeatedly had to hear from American naval officers reviews of Akulin. They spoke of him as a specialist with great respect, unanimously noted his personal charm and ability to conduct business. However, I soon became convinced of this myself. On the same day we talked with Akulin's deputy, engineer captain of the second rank V.I. Minakov, who headed the Marine Department of the Procurement Commission. It turned out that the acceptance of ships and boats handed over to us by Soviet representatives at the shipyards is not supposed to be carried out. In fact, our duties are reduced only to accounting of cargoes sent to the USSR, including boats. Such organization of work, imposed, as it turned out, by the U.S. Maritime Ministry, was absolutely unacceptable for us. Therefore, we came to the conclusion that it was necessary first to report on the current situation with the acceptance of ships under Lend-Lease for our fleet to Admiral L.M. Galler, and secondly, to appeal to the Americans with a proposal to authorize admission of our group to the relevant factories and shipyards for direct observation of the construction and testing of boats, as well as their acceptance. While waiting for the decision, I started to study the drawings of rescue boats transferred to the USSR, which were supposed to be used as small submarine hunters. Such boats were widely used in the British and American fleets to rescue airplane crews shot down over the sea. They had a wooden semi-gliding hull, 2 400-horsepower Hall-Scott engines, and 2 twin large-caliber machine guns. At the request of Soviet representatives in the United States, the Americans agreed to additionally arm these boats with a 20mm Ehrlichman-type machine gun and small depth bombs. But even in this form, the boats were far inferior in their combat capabilities to the Soviet small hunters of the Mo-4 type, and could hardly serve as an effective means of fighting submarines. Therefore, having studied the drawings, I proposed to ask the Americans to install on the boats at least the simplest hydroacoustic equipment to search for submarines, engine noise silencer, smokescreen equipment, another automatic Ehrlichman, and replace small depth bombs with large ones. All this required changes in the design of the hull of the boat. Admiral Akulin, having checked the technical feasibility of these changes, agreed with their expediency. Now it was necessary to obtain permission for corrections in the project from the responsible persons in the Maritime Ministry. February 18th, I left for New York to check the shipment to the USSR torpedo boats type Higgins. These boats had much in common with our D3, but differed in stronger armament in addition to 2 twin machine guns and 2 20mm automatic Oerlikon. With almost the same displacement as the D3, they developed less speed up to 42 knots. Higgins were loaded on the American transport, which was to go to Murmansk with the next convoy. The boats were not accepted by our representatives at the shipyards. The Soviet convoy officer only recorded the fact of shipment. When inspecting the boats, I immediately found significant erosion of the propellers. This meant that the propellers could fail rather quickly. Therefore, after my return to Washington and the corresponding report to M.I. Akolin, the Procurement Commission demanded from the American side to supply the boats with an additional set of propellers. In addition, I drew Akolin's attention to the fact that the Higgins are armed with torpedo tubes, from which it is impossible to fire our torpedoes. There is only one way out. It is necessary to buy American. On the supply of torpedoes, as the further course of events showed, to agree with the Maritime Ministry was not possible. Therefore, in the USSR, torpedo apparatus had to be removed and replaced by domestic. In general, the trip to New York was very useful and once again confirmed the need for careful acceptance by Soviet representatives received under the Lend-Lease equipment. Finally, permission was received for a group of Soviet officers to leave for the shipyard in the city of Tampa. Before leaving, I attended a reception at our naval attaché, Captain First Rank I. Egorichov, which he arranged for some senior officers of the Maritime Ministry. All of them are directly related to Lend-Lease deliveries to the USSR. This is my first contact with American officers. And now the train is rushing us south. White, sun-drenched towns, fields apparently, cotton plantations float past the windows. The names of the states Virginia, North and South Carolina, Georgia recall the events of the American Civil War. But all this is the distant past. First of all, we should think about the tasks of today. How will our relations with the naval commanders of the place? The American fleet has a lot of history. Knowledge of the stages of its development is essential for establishing contacts. The creation of a big fleet was proclaimed in the early XX century by President Theodore Roosevelt. He said that for the USA, the hour of realization of permanent control over the world had passed, and for this purpose it is necessary big baton the fleet. In 1909, by the end of Roosevelt's presidency, the US already had 20 battleships, which were the basis of dominance on the seas until the Second World War. The creation of the US Big Fleet was based on the theory of Admiral Mahan, a close friend of the president. It was a program to create an American world empire, the program of maritime strategy of US imperialism aimed at gaining world domination by the fleet. Mahan's theory became a state doctrine in the United States. Before World War II, the US paid much attention to the construction of the fleet. In 1927, a program was adopted to build 16 warships, and in 1933 another 96. In 1940, President F.D. Roosevelt signed a law on the fleet of 2 oceans, which provided for the construction of new battleships, line cruisers, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and submarines, a total displacement of 1,325,000 tons, the acquisition or conversion of auxiliary ships with a total displacement of 100,000 tons, and the allocation of $50 million for the construction of anti-submarine ships, as well as various small ships of other classes. The implementation of this program was under the leadership of Maritime Secretary W.F. Knox. Maritime Minister in the States a civilian person, a politician, and the Maritime Ministry decides the issues of construction, supply of the fleet, etc. Navy, he is also its commander-in-chief, but do not think that the US Navy was created almost anew. On the tonnage of warships it in 1941, only slightly inferior to the British and surpassed the Japanese. By battleships, the American fleet ranked first in the world, by aircraft carriers third, by cruisers, destroyers and submarines second. The shipbuilding industry in the country was working at full speed, and without interference the American continent was separated from the theatres of war by the oceans. Already at the end of 1941, 15 battleships, 17 aircraft carriers, 48 cruisers, 271 destroyers, SM3 submarines and hundreds of anti-submarine ships were being built simultaneously. The Maritime Ministry was therefore able to quickly make up for the heavy losses suffered at sea during the first period of the war from Japanese naval strikes. In 1943, when we arrived in America, the Pacific and Atlantic fleets numbered hundreds of warships of various classes. It took us several days to familiarize ourselves with the construction of large AM-type minesweepers at the shipyard in Tampa, a city spread on the Gulf of Mexico, and to solve business issues. We were satisfied with the pace and quality of work. We managed to agree with the shipyard management on the organization of supervision of the construction by Soviet crews and on the study by our officers, petty officers and sailors of the minesweepers, their mechanisms and weapons. Having finished the work, I and Engineer Captain Lieutenant P. A. favor of together with our families left for Miami. We were accompanied by the interpreter Ekaterina Sergeyevna Udalova. We were to settle in Miami for a long time to receive the very rescue boats, which the Soviet Procurement Commission asked the Maritime Ministry to retrofit. It took exactly 1 month from the day of our arrival in Washington before we were able to get down to the concrete work, an unacceptably long period of time for wartime. But what can you do? The deadlines were determined not by us, but by our American allies. In Miami, we need to establish the necessary contacts with the officers of the Gulf of Mexico Naval District Headquarters. District, which was commanded by Rear Admiral Monroe, was responsible for the defense of the Florida Peninsula, the Gulf of Mexico, the Yucatan Strait, and the coastal waters of western Cuba. To the south began the operational area of the Caribbean Naval District, and to the north began the Eastern Naval District, which stretched along the U.S. Atlantic coast from Jacksonville to Canada. Available to the district's anti-submarine ships, airplanes and airships provided protection of convoys of ships, conducted a continuous search for German submarines. All naval districts in the Atlantic were part of the 10th Fleet, which was the operational control body of anti-submarine defense. It was commanded by Admiral E. King, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Navy. Here in Miami, there was also a training center for submarine fighters to train officers and enlisted men, and nearby in Key West Training Center for training hydroacoustics and practicing submarine attacks. These training facilities were to receive our crews for training. We settled into small cottages. My wife was still unpacking when the first visitor appeared. It was an American of Russian descent, about 60 years old. He greeted us, mixing Russian and English words, and offered his help. It turned out that our guest, a carpenter by profession, had come to the United States for work at the beginning of the century from a poor Belarusian village. He was about to return home, but the First World War broke out. He learned about the arrival of the Russians from his son, a cab driver who drove us to the cottage. The cab driver did not dare to talk to us, as he hardly knows Russian. I have met quite often with people from pre-revolutionary Russia who once went to work in the United States and for one reason or another could not return home. As a rule, all of them sincerely tried to do something to help their former homeland. The day after we arrived in Miami, Favorov and I were already on the slipway of the shipyard Miami Shipbuilding Company. John Trumpy and San, where the first 5 boats were being built for the USSR. The representative of the U.S. Navy at the plant was the son of the owner of the company, aka his companion. We inspected the boats together. Their construction was already finishing, and Trumpy's son was very sorry that the expected instructions from Washington about the boats re-equipping in accordance with our proposals could be realized only when the next series of small hunters were laid down on the slipway. Still, I was satisfied that our fleet would begin to receive anti-submarine boats, more or less satisfying the conditions of the war. Trumpy's son promised to do his best. The firm was certainly interested in receiving new orders and asked the Russian captive not to worry. Without wasting time, together with E.S. Udalova, I began to translate the inscriptions on the instrument panels of the boat's equipment, as well as instructions for the operation of mechanisms and other technical documentation. A few days passed, and an order came from Washington to re-equip the boats according to our proposals, starting with the next series. However, new complications soon arose. Representatives of the U.S. Navy arrived at the shipyard, Commanders Pillsbury and Smith, who said that re-equipping the boats is impossible if the Maritime Ministry decided to transfer these boats not to us and their fleet, They cannot be used as rescue boats. Unfortunately, the commanders could not be persuaded. Moreover, when the first 5 boats were launched, the Americans refused to hand them over to us. The Maritime Ministry motivated its decision by the fact that the next convoy across the Atlantic to the USSR will not go soon, and the boats are needed by the US Navy. We had to spend a lot of effort to obtain the permission of the Maritime Ministry to ship these 5 boats to New York for shipment to the USSR with the next convoy. Taking into account that attempts to disrupt deliveries to the USSR were still possible, I suggested to Admiral M.I. Akulin to send the boats not only across the Atlantic, but also from San Francisco to Vladivostok on our transports. The solution of the questions about the rearming of small hunters, fulfillment of the delivery plan, sending the boats through San Francisco, all this took time, effort and nerves. But the results were there. The boats were sent to Vladivostok in those periods when no convoys across the Atlantic to the Soviet Union were expected, and the John Trumpy shipyard started building small hunters with all the modifications we had envisioned, except for the installation of hydroacoustic equipment. The Maritime Ministry refused to equip the boats with even the simplest devices for hydroacoustic search of submarines, claiming that there were no such devices available. It was hard to believe it back in World War I. The Americans had installed hydroacoustic means on anti-submarine boats, including those purchased by Russia. In the Russian Navy, they were called Beskumny-type fighters. And in World War II, in the United States, to combat submarines in the coastal zone, used a whole fleet of boats owned by private individuals. They were armed with hydroacoustic equipment and radio communications.